This is the third in a series of 3 videos on Freud's famous 3 constructs that govern human behavior: the id, the ego, and the superego. It's a bit of an odd topic for a CBT psychologist to cover, but this is an aspect of Freud's thinking that can really be helpful. In previous videos, I've covered the id, the source of unrestrained drive and motivation, and the superego, which is the constraining or inhibiting element that we might think of as the conscience, but which tends to incorporate a lot of unreasonable or excessive rules that can make life a misery. Today I'm going to talk about the ego. Now, that term, ego, gets a bit confusing. It's tempting to say, oh, I know what that is. It's the idea that I'm so great, that I'm the center of the universe, that I'm all that matters, that I'm the greatest. And in Buddhism, a lot of the goal is to get past your ego to at least some extent. That's not really what Freud meant by the term. It's a shame that we use the same word for it because it confuses all kinds of people, right? Think of it as a homonym, like the word bat. Same spelling, same word, but it means 2 completely different things. A winged animal and an object you use to hit a ball. Totally different. So what is Freud's ego? Well, essentially it's a kind of mediator. But when you think of mediation in a legal sense, you usually think of 2 entities on either side of the table. This ego has to juggle 3 sets of demands. On the one hand, there's the selfish id. Let's say you're in a crowded bar and you see this unbelievably attractive person, and your id might be thinking, oh, I really want to touch them all over. Your id's a bit of a maniac, really, but without it, you would probably never do anything. Now, your superego might be thinking, oh, that's disgusting, you pig. You shouldn't even be thinking such a thing. All you want is to have sex, hit people. All you ever think about is yourself. You should be ashamed. You're horrible. Okay, so that's 2. Who's the third person at the table? It's the outside world. If you acted on your id impulses, this bar would go nuts and you'd be in serious trouble. Maybe you'd be thrown out. Maybe the police would come. Who knows? So the ego sits between these 3, the id, the superego, and reality. And it tries to work something out. Now, maybe it really is reasonable to try to get to know this person. You're single, you've been wanting to date, and you can't just go up and manhandle them. Neither your superego nor the other bargoers would stand for it. It's a genuinely lousy idea. But maybe your superego would let you say something entertaining about the band as you pass by on the way to the bar, so long as your hands were in your pockets. And it's unlikely that this person or the other people in the bar would find that outrageous. You know how this kind of place works. It has social rules like every social setting, and you've been around long enough to know what they are, even though they're not posted anywhere. So the bar is okay with it. Your id gets to introduce yourself to this person, and your superego doesn't shame you so long as you behave yourself. Your ego does its job at balancing those 3 sets of demands. Now, if your ego isn't strong enough, it might not be able to restrain you from just acting on your impulses, and you'll spend your life in a lot of trouble. For example, some people are constantly stealing. Their id sees some nice shiny stuff, they want it, and the ego is not strong enough to hold them back, even though their superego knows this is not a good thing and will only make them feel guilty later on. So the id is winning the battles all the time. Conversely, maybe the superego is too strong and always wins. The person never gets to do anything fun, and they can never let loose, even when most people would say that it's fine if they do. We might say that these people are too inhibited. Or maybe the outside world gets its way too easily. The person spends their entire life trying to live up to the expectations of other people. Everything is based on what the circumstances require. Work wants you to give 110% every day so that you're exhausted by the time you get home. So you do. And it's only when you're alone that you get to do more of what you actually like. So you can see that this version of the ego isn't really the big narcissist, the egotist that we often think about when we say, that guy's all ego. That's a totally different thing. This ego is the ability to look at those three influences and come up with creative ways to satisfy both the id and the superego while not getting in too much trouble with the outside world. Or maybe, if you're somebody like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King or Harvey Milk, you do get in trouble, but it's trouble that you've consciously chosen to get into. A strong ego is a creative one. It's also one able to look at the id and the superego with a critical eye. It recognizes that your desire to have unsafe sex with everything that moves is not a great idea and needs to have a tight leash on it. But it also recognizes when the superego is too finicky or moralistic in a way that doesn't let you live your own life. And it can override some of the superego's crazy rules. So maybe you were brought up with a superego that says, for example, being gay is a bad thing, but the ego is strong enough to say, and yet, here I am. And you need to figure out how to be who you are without destroying that part of yourself. Now, a strong ego can also look at the outside world and see things that you'd like to help change rather than just accepting. So it may not be convenient to be a part of Black Lives Matter, but you might decide that, yeah, you need to try to change things anyway. A strong ego has to be creative. It has to be able to read this bar, take into account our own ethical or moral principles, and notice what it is that we really want or hope for, and come up with a workable solution, like maybe a witty remark that will get the attention of that attractive person, and maybe more will follow if the relationship develops. Maybe you're furious at the boss who's constantly dropping a ton of work on your desk at 3 p.m. on Fridays. Your id just wants to scream at him. Your superego is appalled that you would ever think of such a thing. After all, that poor man is so stressed out. And the external reality is that would get you fired. A strong ego might be able to come up with a kind, clear, assertive way of communicating your concern to your boss. Something that he'll be able to understand and act on. And if he doesn't, something will tell you that maybe it's time to think about moving to another company. So in Freud's homonym of the word ego, he meant a part of ourselves that's either the repository for all those creative skills we use to get by in a complex social environment, or it's the part of the mind that makes use of those skills. The id is your accelerator. The superego is your brake. Reality is the street and highway system. But what determines the journey itself? That's decided upon and carried out by the ego, using the accelerator and the brake to navigate us to where we want to go in life. The ego is you, the driver, and you want to be a strong and effective one.